with the situation in Quebec, I mean, like, we have a lot of gaps in the education field. We don't have enough workers. We don't have enough educators. We don't have enough people. Like, we don't have enough staff in general in this field. And we're kind of, like you said, it's not pragmatic. We're just cutting a category of people that we could have used to offer these services, and it's just not profiting to anyone. It's not profiting to the Quebec government. It's not profiting to the community, the people of Quebec, and also religious minorities. So it's just unfortunate, definitely.
Hi everyone, it's Kalden Dhatsenpa, host of Local 514, Montreal News from a radically different perspective. Recently, I read this article that I think is unfortunately very relevant, very familiar to people living in Quebec. This article was published in The Rover in February. It's called Bill 94 Put Their Teaching Degrees on Hold. It is about two Muslim education students who are, I guess, in certain terms, reconsidering careers, considering trajectories of their lives because of Bill 94, which received assent in late November of last year. The bill sort of, in classic conservative Québécois fashion, targets, isolates others, religious minorities in Quebec, for wearing a veil. People who are going to be in public view, the Quebec government, led by the CAC, has deemed are ineligible or unfit to have these public roles. Today, I'm speaking to Zaineb, who wrote the article for the Rover. We're going to talk about the content of the article, as well as what didn't make the final piece, and just the wider conversation around Islamophobia in Quebec. Zaineb, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course, of course, of course. We are recording remotely today. There is a terrible storm of freezing rain, but yeah. Let's I appreciate you being here. Let's get into this. So
For sure.
the bill passed the National Assembly, the 70 in favor, 27 against. And you know what? Tell me about, the bill, this article. How did this all start to come into work?
Yeah, for sure. So a bit more about Bill 94 for some of those who don't know. Officially, Bill 94 is an act to, in particular, reinforce laïcité in the education network and to amend various legislative provisions. It was introduced by Minister Bernard Drinville, Minister of Education, and some people like to call it, I guess, a kind of extension of Bill 21. That's not exactly the case, but we can see definitely a similar pattern in how it tries to extend its laïcité into specifically the education network. So a bit more about what it does and the limitation it introduces. It does include basically extending the prohibition of wearing religious signs to the entire staff members of schools, daycares. So that wouldn't be only teachers. With Bill 21, what was the argument, the incentive behind it was that people in power shouldn't be wearing a religious sign in fear of like them taking advantage of people, or using religious rhetorics to exercise their power. What is interesting with Bill 94 is that that's kind of not the case anymore. Even people that are going to come to volunteers, parents that are volunteering in schools, students are volunteering in school as well with the children are going to be affected by this bill. And there is a grandfather clause, but what is interesting is the grandfather clause only applies to those that have been employed before the introduction of the bill. So it's not even after it had passed. It's really like the moment that it was talked about, the moment that it was brought up by the Quebec government. From that day, the people that started a position at a school will be affected by Bill 94. And we've seen that happening recently with some teachers from the Commission Scolaire de Mille-Îles who have been either terminated from their position or have had to resign because of Bill 94. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's I'm happy you bring up that the thing about extensions, right, of Bill 21, because Bill 21 was kind of about public servants, right, at large, you know, judges,
Yeah,
lawyers, anyone who was an employee, a public facing employee of the government. There's sort of a question
exactly.
of like, because we are secular, because we're trying to separate church from state, as a representative of the state, you cannot be having any kind of religious ornamentation or symbols on you, you know. But now here they are with Bill 94, as I understand it, really targeting the education sector, you know. And I guess that's at the core of course, the bill and your piece as well, where you talk about these two Muslim education students, right? So I guess what I'm hearing here is because the bill has this grandfather clause, but that the clause is pretty set pretty far back to even the
Yeah.
introduction of the bill, right? There's a lot of people being excluded by that, and it sounds like these two Muslim education
Mm-hmm.
students as well. And of course, you know, I think it's important to note it's not just these two students, right? There's many stories in the last few weeks about dozens of people being let go at school boards across Montreal, the Montreal area, and I'm sure the case is the same if you go
Mm-hmm.
further out. So, tell me about how you
Yeah.
came across the these two students, these two Muslim education students.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing to note is, as a Muslim myself, um, I've kind of examined closely this phenomenon of laïcité in Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
even from, my youth, starting from the Quebec mass shooting that happened in the mosque there. And that's kind of when I started to kind of building this network of students, of people that have had these experiences or that were committed to kind of telling the stories of some of these people in our community. And it kind of happened like very, I would say, fast. And like I told you, unfortunately, at the right moment, at the right time. So, funny enough, I was supposed to publish an article, final article for an assignment because I am a journalism student. And yeah, I've received a message from one of my friends who is studying, to be a social worker at schools, and she told me that her friends in the Faculty of Education at l'Université de Montréal received an email around November, telling them that starting from a certain date, they would have to respect the new prohibitions, new reglement, of Bill 94. And these girls happened to be women that were wearing the hijab, and they kind of froze, right? It was kind of a big shocker for these girls, a big shocker for all of us. And she kind of shared that. She was like, what is happening? Like, we didn't think it would be coming this soon. And yeah, I told her to let me get in contact with these girls. We need to cover these stories. This is really important. This is something that I think a lot of people kind of didn't think would happen as well, which is interesting because we thought it would only be people working, people in the profession. Now we're having students that are wearing religious symbols that have to do traineeships in schools that will also be affected by Bill 94. And
Mm-hmm.
the thing with most, if not all, education programs in Quebec is that they are obligated to do traineeships. They need to do traineeships to have their diploma, and they have like a placement system where they are placed into a public school, could be a private, depends on the case of the student. But when they heard the news, it was like, yeah, how are we even going to get our diploma? How are we even going to get our degree? Now we're put in a barrier for a student to even complete their education, to complete their studies, and how is that, like in any capacity, a way to enforce laïcité in a way that is fair, that is neutral, and that is in respect as well of citizens and their life plans. So
Mhm.
that's what I was trying to highlight, I believe, and that's what was really interesting with these girls and their stories.
No, of course. I think whenever I hear about the effects of these kinds of bills, what you hear is, I think you said the word right, like these barriers, these kind of blocks, right? Of like,
Yeah.
here's this kind of projected future they had, and here's that legislation that acts as a block, and it's like, I think it's very like, it's very calculated, and it's like this concerted effort to keep, uh, I mean, obviously, like veiled women, people wearing a kippah with a turban outside of public life, right? It's like there are jobs that you can have, there are jobs that you can't have, and the government is trying to say you can't have these kinds of jobs. We don't want you.
Mm.
I mean, I think especially in the school, right? The school is a very like political place in that like it's you have these future generations, right, of like Quebecers, of Montrealers, right, kind of being brought up, raised, educated in these schools, and to see like, let's say, a veiled woman, someone with a turban, it's like, oh, there's like a normalization that happens with that, they're like, oh,
Yeah.
this is a regular person, and I've now like been in contact with this person, I trust this person, and
Mhm.
there's this like I think there's this complete furthering of this isolation, or that it makes people who wear any kind of religious symbols, or who have religious symbols
Yeah.
on them, kind of much more like
Mhm.
alien, right, to these future generations of students who won't have the familiarity with it, in regular context like a school. um I'm really curious about, like, like the, let's call it temperament, like how are these two students feeling, as you're like, what did their outlook look like, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it is really uh kind of a heartbreaking situation.
Mm-hmm.
And um just from the time that I've had to talk with them, kind of sharing what they've been through, um it's kind of this ongoing cycle of we tried our best to uh, integrate ourselves. We tried our best to give whatever we had, whatever
Mm-hmm.
skills, whatever talent that we could offer to the community. And these girls are people that do either volunteering on the side or are working with their community, and there's value in what they do, and that's what inspires them to continue with that path. And for
Mm-hmm.
both girls, what they shared as well when you read the article is that when they started their program in university, there was already Bill 21. They knew that their future in education, in the educational field, was not going to be in Quebec because of the already existing barriers of Bill 21. But they were
Mm-hmm.
still willing to go forward with, helping their community in some capacity by doing their traineeship, and also just volunteering with children at schools. They were also, preparing as well to possibly move forward with other projects. Could be a psychoeducation educator, sorry, psychosocial work, in case that anything would happen. And now with Bill 94, that kind of is the case. Some of them, not these two girls specifically, but some of the other girls that they do know that they've talked to me about, either some changed programs, so they've went
Mm-hmm.
to another program not education related, or they're also thinking of moving to Ottawa to continue their education. So yeah, I guess it was just that the discussion with them was just a bit saddening. They were brainstorming how they would get around this bill, brainstorming what's next for them, and kind of thinking of their future, instead of being in the moment and focusing on
Mm-hmm.
what they can bring. And especially with the situation in Quebec, I mean, like, we have a lot of gaps in the education field. We don't have enough workers. We don't have enough educators. We don't have enough people. Like, we don't have enough staff in general in this field. And we're kind of, like you said, it's not pragmatic. We're just cutting a category of people that we could have used to offer these services, and it's just not profiting to anyone. It's not profiting to the Quebec government. It's not profiting to the community, the people of Quebec, and also religious minorities. So it's just unfortunate, definitely.
I think it's clear. I'm happy you brought up that thing about those spots that need to be filled, right? I think in your article, you spoke to someone from the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and they highlight that there's
Yeah,
in Quebec right now there's 5,000 spots to be filled in the education system. And it's not
yeah,
like this has been sort of like an ongoing issue in a lot of public sectors, right? In education and health and healthcare as well. And now here you have the government, like not really solving that and instead adding fuel to the fire, and I think it's very
mm-hmm.
telling that like these dismissals, the heart of this is coming from something that's not quite like it's not like some kind of like lived problem, right? It's not like there's this, it's not like I hardly hear anything about like a bunch of schools with Muslim, Sikh, Jewish educators, right? And who are constantly getting into some kind of like trouble, let's say, because of those kinds of like religious symbols. It's like a non-issue,
Yeah,
like it's on the ground
yeah,
for those people and for the people around them in that community, right? Like other educators, students, it's seems to be a non-issue, at least from this lack of coverage about what those problems might be. And it seems to be instead an issue about just the idea, right, of like that these educators, that these people in these public roles. And actually I should say, I think we have to highlight it's not just educators, it's not just public roles anymore, it's even volunteers. It could be
exactly.
a mother of two, who has the veil and who volunteers at her school. I read this report about this one mother who's been volunteering for years, and was considering to work as an
Yep.
educator as well. And then here you have
Mm-hmm.
the government coming down and being like, despite we don't care that you actually care about your community, you care about your kids, and we don't care about your actual efforts. What we care about is that you have these religious symbols, and we are not about that. And we're targeting you. You can't work here. It's such a, it's such a clear. I want to say like culture war kind of thing, right? It's a clear kind of like we've had. I mean, so your piece was published in the Rover. We had the editor in chief Chris Curtis on back in December, and he really highlighted that like in his eyes, it's like this is the CAC. They see trouble coming up, right? We have a provincial elections coming up later this year. The CAC is not doing well in the polls. What do? You go back to the classics. You go back to Bill 21. You go back to the same kind of
Exactly.
alienation, right, of Muslims and other religious minorities. It's just terrible to see, especially with the data showing that this is not really about um, being pragmatic. It's not about actual issues. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
so clear that it is about fear mongering. I'm kind of curious what you think of the data, right? Because it's like Bill 21 was passed. It's been passed for years now.
Yeah.
What did you find in your search for data around Bill 21?
100%. Well, for starters, I would like to go back to what you mentioned about Bill 94 and like how
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a non-issue what we've seen with the schools, and like we haven't really heard about issues related to religious proselytism or people using religion in their position of power in schools. What is interesting is that actually Bill 94, even like within the bill document, but also was said by Bernard Drinville. He said it's was passed in light of the Belford incident, the school where we've had stories, and there was also an enquête that was being done on the school there, along with I think three other schools in Quebec at that time, to investigate, do a report on the laïcité. Was it being
Mm-hmm.
enforced in the schools? And what is interesting is that even from people that I know have worked in some of these schools, and from what we see is the actual issue with the Belfort incident, was that the staff was just it was not necessarily related to religion. It was not necessarily related to their faith and how they were enforcing it on students. It was just actually a lack of unqualified teachers. These people were unqualified. Some of them were really harsh on students. Some of them were not formed properly to, like to have in their classrooms students that have special needs. There were issues revolving around topics of giving the fulfilling the needs of students, right? It was not particularly about them being put in this religious fearful environment and
Mm-hmm.
kind of enforcing that on the students.
They were
That
trying
was
to
not really the
convert the
issue.
students or anything.
Exactly, and
You
they
know.
they tried to push that narrative, which was almost like the last thing you would have looked at when going into Belfort, and they kind of pushed it to in the report to then have an incentive, have a reason to um, bring Bill 94, right? And even with like when we talked about the lack of people in the educational field, that was even Minister Bernard Ravil again, like clearly admitting we have a lack of unqualified teachers. Yeah, we have a lack of unqualified teachers, and we're pitting again, something that will not help with this issue. Surveys have shown that this will not help with this issue. And to come back to the point of data, I think that's the unfortunate thing with what we've had, since Bill 21 is there isn't enough data. It's really scarce. We don't have enough data. We don't have enough research on the topic, even like just for Bill 21. So I can't imagine for like Bill 94, possibly Bill 9, with Bill 9 being currently in the committee stage, being in consultation. Um, it like I cannot get a grasp of how we've kind of slipped. We've kind of failed to provide that data, to
Mm-hmm.
provide reasons and explanations as to how these bills are not working. They're not profiting to anyone, and if not, they're counterproductive in most of cases we've seen. And I think that's what kind of we need to work on a bit. Following the announcement of Bill 9, we, even at school, at Concordia University, we've had, like students mobilizing a bit to kind of talk with the dean. We've also had that with Bill 94. So there's this mobilization, but unfortunately, like these people don't have legislative power. Like they can't really do much about it. We can just try to find ways to accommodate students. We can just try to find ways to accommodate workers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of the thing that I hope to maybe highlight in my article is that whatever the NCCM provided me with is kind of some of the only data that is available on Bill 21, and we're
Mm-hmm.
just projecting that on Bill 94 to maybe have an idea of what could possibly be the case with Bill 94, like economically, socially, politically, what could this entail? But fortunately, we don't have anything as of right now, so
Mm-hmm.
that is something that needs to be definitely worked on.
No, absolutely. I mean, I feel like this to me this feeds this kind of conclusion I have that like all these things are just it's not about data. It's just about pure like pure emotion. Riling up the base. Fear mongering. It's the same things that kind of I mean that unfortunately led to the mosque shooting. Right. It's like when they interviewed the shooter. He just talked about I was listening to a lot of these conservative like shows, and they were telling me to be afraid of the immigrants. So it's kind of like this is a natural kind of like progression. I think it's especially important to
Mm-hmm.
note that like people like the CAC, politicians who really thrive on this fear mongering of like immigrants, of visible minorities. It's like they inspire like even I think while their field might remain political, there's a lot of inspiration that other people, other actors, political actors who will resort to violence will also see and take inspiration from. I think for our listeners, our viewers, it's important to note that this Québécois right-wing group, La Meurtre, they specifically named François Legault and the CAC as an inspiration to their kind of hateful ideology and their practices and their organization. And of course, Legault does his best to distance himself. He's like, well, I don't agree with them, so it's not like I'm not responsible for this. But of course, you're responsible. It's like that's where all of these policies, all of this kind of um normalize. This is what these policies normalize, right? I think that's something that
100%.
that's important to note that these bills do, which I think your piece really gets into. So now I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious on another front. You talked briefly about the speaking to the dean of Concordia. I'm kind of curious what kind of. I'm sure that I've seen some school boards kind of come out, in strong opposition to Bill 21, Bill 94. I'm curious what the support looks like from certain institutions.
Yeah. I mean, it's a case by case situation, most definitely. In regards to Concordia, like without going into details, I think they're definitely like in somewhat of a support. They've been also with Bill 21, so in general, English school boards and English universities are not really fond of those bills, and
Mhm.
especially because a lot of their students happen to be of these religious communities and happen to also be international students. They don't want to have the impacts of these bills kind of and in consequence affect their student body. So definitely, I mean, Concordia is receptive to the concerns of the students. I would say I have to highlight that. Although, of course, like I said, not much can be really done on Bill 94 because it depends. Bill 94, it's not enacted yet like everywhere as
Mhm.
I've seen. In my knowledge, the only commission scolaire that have Bill 94, in place are the Commission scolaire de Montréal, which are the ones that have sent the email to the two students that I highlight in my article. There's also the Commission scolaire de Mille, from which we've seen the story of the 12, workers in schools uh, being terminated or, having to quit their position.
Mhm.
So even with like universities, it's also a special case. Like for example, Bill 21 like didn't apply fully into universities, but now there's a risk. There's definitely a risk with Bill 94 and possibly Bill 9, with a lot of these things like really uh, being into effect. So I guess what these universities, what these schools can do is kind of provide emotional and mental support for the people affected.
Mhm.
They can also kind of try to find solutions in terms of not necessarily bypassing these laws, but just kind of giving them much as they can in their capacity without breaking those laws. And obviously, before they get passed, being big advocates, being very vocal about their miscontent and their opposition to these bills.
Mhm.
So we want that to be seen with Bill 9. Now we've talked to them with Bill 9, and this is kind of what we're pushing. We're kind of pushing, support from these institutions and a support for the students that might be affected and the people that might be affected as well. And I hope that there is more to come as well with other universities, maybe some sort of coalition for all of them
Mhm.
to, get mobilized and try to hold the power accountable. But yeah, I guess besides that, like we're just waiting. We're just kind of on hold,
Mhm.
kind of seeing what's coming up next, right? And that's kind of unfortunate, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm curious, as yourself, someone who's wears the veil, who's looking to work in public life. What is your outlook for the future? What do you think is next?
I mean, it's kind of a hard thing to tell. I mean, definitely not positive views. I can't really be lying on that point, especially as a Muslim woman myself, having worn the hijab for like quite some time. I believe like since I was 13, so pretty young, right? And I've experienced that wave of Islamophobia. I've experienced it in its rises. You mentioned Christopher Curtis. Haven't mentioned
Mhm.
something about election periods coming up and La CAC going with their uh, hateful speeches, hateful rhetorics about this is our identity. We want laïcité. We don't want Muslims around, right? I've experienced that. I think in my time being a hijabi, from the Quebec mosque shooting. Actually, the imam of our mosque at the time, they had recently moved to Quebec, and was unfortunately there the shooting. Uh, thankfully nothing happened to him, but it was a shock. Mentally, you can't really get past that, and that was a
Mhm.
shock as well for our community. And it's kind of, it's really like, it doesn't bring value, it doesn't bring anything to the civil environment. Even for us, like 1 week after the Quebec shooting, our mosque got vandalized. Normally, it should have been, like a different type of response that we would have seen from
Mhm.
the Quebec population, a wave of support, and we've seen that definitely. I do want to highlight the positive of these hardships. We've seen a wave of support and everything, but at the same time, see how it like normalizes those hateful actions and hateful rhetorics. And then again, like past the Quebec mosque shooting, it kind of goes down. Then again, like the Quebec elections coming around 2019 happens with Bill 21. Bill 21 gets enacted. And again, a rising wave of Islamophobia that I've
Mhm.
noticed from experience. Again, what happened with Bill 94, we've seen a rise again, a recent rise. Some women that I know that also wore the hijab, some of them cannot get past a week without having like a single comment being told to them, right?
Mhm.
Like by weekly, they get comments, they get racist, remarks, and I don't think that's the Quebec that any of us want to live in. And I think that's why it's important to really just give ourselves, a platform to raise our voices, to be able to let everyone know about our experiences. And what is actually unfortunate as well is that from within our community, there is a lot of fear for some of them. There's a lot of fear in speaking out. I remember there was someone that had been stabbed by someone uh, because they looked Muslim. They were Muslim. They looked Muslim, supposedly. So the person stabbed them, and that person did not want to get their story kind of going around social media. I think it's
Mhm.
also coming from a place of like honor, and coming from a place of I don't want my image to be kind of put around there, and kind of being seen as a victim. So in that sense, that also limits us in our mobilization, because like if from within the community we think like that, then nothing can really be done.
Mhm.
And I guess from us, we need to also reform some of the ways that we've been organizing, we've been kind of battling Bill 21, Bill 94, most definitely. So that's kind of my take on it. That's kind of my
Mhm.
experience with it.
Right, right. Different ways that you believe the community should meet the moment.
Yep.
We're past 30 minutes. I'm curious. You have any concluding remarks, Zainab?
Um, I guess I would invite everyone to read the article. I really want these girls to have their story heard, and I would definitely encourage anyone, if they want to talk a bit more about the topic, to get in contact with their Muslim friend, Muslim colleague, even me, if that's something that they want to talk about. That's something I'm definitely open to doing. And it is in the heart of my advocacy work as well. So yeah, that's the message that I would like to send.
Incredible. Thank you so much for this interview.
No worries, appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
This was Kalden Dhatsenpa, host of Local 514, speaking to Zaineb Karkachi, who wrote Bill 94, put their teaching degrees on hold, available to read on the Rover. We will have a link to that in the caption. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Take care.